So, what is human nature and how does that influence how we would run our groups? So, I think starting in the 40s, 50s, 60s, every theory of personality would eventually develop into a group model. So, think of, say, object relations therapy, and there's a Americanized and a European tradition of this, but really looking at one of the primary universal human drives for all people across all time would be wanting to connect, wanting to be in relationships, and doing our very best to be in relationship with one another and having many, many distorted ways of going about how to be in relationship. So in group, we would look at how this relational drive manifests, how it's functional, how it's dysfunctional, building off of, earlier analytic traditions, how there may be transferences and inaccurate object representations, and in some writers, self object representations, and how through the interactions in group, we can help people have different experience, confounding experiences, even learn new skills, new ways of being, get uh, see through our previous transferences that we have, and work through some of the developmental stages of, say, Klein's theory of psychotic, not seeing the world accurately, to kind of the depressive position of seeing the flaws and the mixed quality of ourselves and others in the world around us. And then I went through a phase where I read every or many of the classic theorists' last paper. And in Klein's last paper talks about how she shouldn't have stopped at just a depressive position, but life can have meaning. Our relationships can have meaning. Our relationships can have enjoyment. This would be kind of the third position for Klein after the depressive position. And I imagine it took a long time for Klein to get there. So this would be one example. I can quickly talk about some other examples. Another popular school of psychoanalytic group approach would be self-psychology, where there's these core kind of self skills of reality testing, impulse control, being able to reflect on oneself. And that part of the work in group is to have people have these experiences uh, it, uh, that help them get exposed and to learn these kind of self skills, whether this is Heinz Hartman from the 30s, moving forward to, say, Kohut. And then, working from the Kohut idea of kind of empathy, accurate empathy, attunement, was all very, very powerful in creating psychic change. So uh, I went through a period where uh, early in my career, in the daytime, I was doing groups at community mental health. And these would be addiction recovery groups. These could be employment groups. These would be post hospitalization groups. Uh, these would be crisis management groups. These would be working with anxiety groups. And as I worked there in the daytime, the center would change with different models. At first, it was strength based, not focusing on pathology, but focusing on what the client does well, what strengths they have, what strengths they could use to face the challenges in their life. Uh, and then the center changed because we didn't have resources and went to a more kind of solution based thing of what would be the little things that we could do to kind of change the client's functioning, change their environment, change the way they approach things in a very short and time limited manner. 6 groups, 12 groups. Then we became a dialectical behavior therapy center where everyone was learning mindfulness and interpersonal skills, self-regulation. Uh, so that's what I was doing in the daytime. Then at night, uh, given my financial responsibilities to myself and to others, I was doing groups in the criminal justice or forensic setting. So this would be uh, parolees, again, substance use, violent offenders, uh, sometimes, but not too often, uh, fraud or stealing or theft or larceny cases, and generally stayed away from working with perpetrators of child sexual abuse, although I had some of those experiences. So in that setting, it was very, very much when I began psychoeducational approach to group, that if you just educate people, they would change. And then that faded away and then became the cognitive behavioral approach of that we would have to teach them skills, point out their cognitive distortions, and that this would be the path in that setting, particularly to reduce recidivism and to increase public safety. So I got really fascinated about which one of these theories was correct. And I think I was still young and naive and thought maybe some are more correct than the others, or maybe one is fully correct in some way. So from that model, we would take the understanding of Buddhism and its theory of personality in the world and then create a group psychotherapy from that model. So, uh, what might that look like, right? For my, at that time and even till today, I don't feel like I have the depth understanding of Buddhism to create a group psychotherapy model out of uh, Buddhist views of personality and psychic change and the influence of the environment. But at that point, as this was an interest of mine, I decided to embark on this path of let's work my way through the history of group psychotherapy and the history of personality theories and the change processes and how they what they would look like in my groups. While I had these prescribed models from my various agencies, I would hold these various models in my mind and do some interventions from these models. So, starting with Freud and thinking about the pleasure principle, I could see hedonism in my clients, and I could see going back to Anna O and chimney sweeping, the power of catharsis and helping people feel better in some way. And then, Freud didn't have one final theory and changed his theory throughout. So moving forward, we had the ideas of beyond the pleasure principle and aggression and thanatos as drives. And what it was unnerving because as I listened and watched my group members, I was able to see their aggressiveness, their drives, their self-defeating behaviors, uh, moving towards, of course, their repetition compulsions. And, working increasingly transferentially between group members and between myself and the group members and trying to uh, first kind of help people regress in this arise or ability to regress in the service of the ego to get these out by raising the tension levels in the group that would bring up more primitive kind of coping styles and object representations or transferences, and then being able to kind of modify them or have them challenged in some way. And, you know, that seemed to help in some way. And then thinking about, civilization and its discontent of Freud, how building on the work of Laban and McDougall and others about how we're really just kind of automatic automaton to the culture around us in some way, and how our clients were uh, just doing what's kind of been prescribed culturally to them, and then trying to highlight when they're becoming automaton, thinking of the violent offender group that, of course, when someone looks at your partner, you go and try to fight them, like just automatic in some way. Uh, and then, I worked my way through uh, object relations and self-psychology, uh, and this eventually became my dissertation of all the how uh, personality theories influence how group leaders lead group and what other therapeutic factors are crossed all these models in this traditional kind of process research therapeutic factors literature. I think at 19, by 2005, there was only, I don't know, a few hundred articles on process research, and I was able to read them all for my dissertation. Now this has become much more popular to integrate outcome and process research together, and I don't think anyone could ever read every article that was written around process research in some way. So I had to, I went back to there's a certain structure of group of people are in a room interacting with one another. And going back to how group has started in some way, you can look at Joseph Pratt, who had an idea that to some degree, education and connecting with other people is really what helps people change and understand. And that education reduces anxiety, and then new habits help with both physical symptoms and psychological symptoms, kind of subtly concentration, developing regulation or focus skills can increase motivation to do the behaviors that will help with changes in one life. And of course, this eventually went into what we see in the therapeutic factor literature of universality and interpersonal feedback, input and output, and that there was a hope was instilled by being with others. So, although Pratt didn't start with a personality theory, he kind of just started doing lectures and then learned that people did better when they talked to each other. There was some underlying personality theory there. And then uh, I think, it's hard to talk about Moreno because it's very, very complex, but felt that, action leads to insight, action leads to new action and new behavior. And that this occurs through enactment where people are better able to see their patterns, and that not completely dissimilar than what we might see in the relational psychoanalytic theories of enactments and then moving into social justice into the socio-cultural enactments, and that having the body involved uh, helped to change the patterns, that some of our pain and neurosis are held in our bodies. And then uh, I think of Pratt and Moreno, and if I would think of a third major figure in the development of group psychotherapy, I would think of Trident Burrow, and it's a wonderful story of someone felt like Burroughs' interpretations were inaccurate about them and suggested they get a group together so other people could understand them and see them and prove Burrow wrong in their interpretations and how they were understanding them. And Burrow went along with this in some way. And as the story goes, that this was very accurate, and Burrow had a lot of humility. So Burrow, although in that psychoanalytic tradition to some degree, also had very unique ideas about new relational patterns changing and shifting people, uh, having new discourses shift and change people, the power of communicating similarities and differences, what would become, again, other kind of core concepts and what makes group helpful and effective in some way. So this presented the opposite point of view of maybe someone just does groups. And I thought of various Buddhist trainings I went to where people would be doing Buddhist practice together, listening to a lecture, often having discussions either as a group or with a teacher. And was there a way to modify that into a Buddhist psychotherapy? And then are we working down different avenues here? That psychotherapy is really about symptom reduction, changing dysfunctional patterns, as opposed to uh, existential angst or dukkha in some way. So skipping back, I talked about how forensic and social and criminal justice kind of got into cognitive behavioral therapy. And I was very interested as I led groups and I looked for how people had cognitive distortions, how the interventions of, is this true all the time, or all or nothing thinking, or giving too much power to the one exception, the exception become the rules, and did that really make people change? And uh, I think this is in the Buddhist tradition that we are exploring our beliefs. And then, the other half of this would be, we're working towards what Buddhism would call clear seeing or something, or more accurate seeing, or seeing through our automatic projective processes into how we interpret the world. Then there's, in behaviorism, there's a ton of practices that change the psyche, right? This is a kind of dated now, but where do we start in psychic change? Do we start with insight and feelings that would change cognitions and behavior? Do we start with the cognitions first and that would change feeling state, emotional states, and behavior, or do we start with behavior? And that would eventually change affective states and cognitive belief structures. So I thought about behaviorism in terms of meditation practice. And I'm going into the basic shamatha or Soto Zen, simple follow your breath as the object of meditation in those kind of traditions. But you sit there, thoughts arise, emotions arise, you may believe what you're thinking and you may go down tangents. And at some moment, uh, you realize that you are thinking and then or feeling, and you kind of come back to the object of meditation. And you do this over and over of training the mind. And of course, this would have, as we see in the mindfulness literature, similarities to some of the outcomes of the mindfulness therapy practices of regulation and frustration tolerance and lack of impulsivity and greater ability to reflect. And that in this way, you could see meditation as kind of a behavioral or even a cognitive behavioral practice in some way. Uh, and then if we're going to just move ahead with the tradition, right, I guess next after cognitive and behavioral therapy, or simultaneously, maybe right before cognitive therapy, we had the humanistic tradition, which similar to Buddhism saw kind of the intrinsic potential in people and downplayed people's suffering as a pathology. In that it's part of the human condition and not evidence of a moral failure in some way. And then also a increased focus on how the here and now brings the then and there with them, and how new behaviors in the moment can be really, really powerful, potentially more powerful than some kind of intellectual exploration of developmental history in some way. So, but let me say a few things about existentialism. So I think if we're thinking about the existential givens, freedom, responsibility, finiteness, are not dissimilar from Buddhism. Often Buddhism puts some emphasis on meditation or in contemplation around the change and mortality, and also explores our own meaning-making processes and how we make meaning and what seems meaningful to us, and then exploring why is that meaningful to us. But I think this is where we looked at all these Western traditions. I think there's something very, very different here, which is, and I would even include some of the mindfulness traditions where there's a really big focus on the self. There's an understanding of the world as discrete objects. There's not an examining of language, of representing or signifying something, and that a very simple view of cause and effect and discrete permanent objects that permeates kind of the Western mind and the Western psychological, psychoanalytic mind. And Buddhism is working from a non-dual tradition. Everything is interconnected. The web of karma is much more complex than just a simple cause and effect research studies that we see in Western psychology or in psychotropic medication studies, and that there are many, many factors that go into creating change in some way. So if we're uh, bringing a Buddha's personality theory into creating a group psychotherapy, in some way we're building off of this kind of Western modernist whiteness view of the world, which is very different than a non-dual view of the world where language is imperfect, where experience is most important, where we're returning to sense phenomena and even somatic experiences, and kind of breaking the default network and neural pathways uh, as a mechanism of change. So let me stop there for this talk.